welcome everybody to the new KPI, the new kindness performance indicators with Andy Bradley. Hi Andy, it's great to see you again. It's a while since we met in Leeds, right at the beginning of the events that ended up creating the festival. Do you want to say a little bit about what you were doing at that time?
Yeah, it's great to be here, Josh. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this conversation. When was that? When did we meet?
I think that was 2018, was it? Maybe 2017 even.
Okay. So I lived down in Brighton, but I was spending a lot of time in Leeds. I was going up and down at least once a month because there was something was happening that was really exciting. And it all really stemmed from an awareness that it might be more powerful to work through the lens of place than to work through the lens of leadership or organizations or businesses or institutions. And so we were getting really interested at that time. We were asking ourselves a really big question, which was, how would we know that we were living in a compassionate city? That was what was really driving my activity, which really stems from a long-term inquiry, which has now been going for about 20 years consciously, which has really been how do we close the compassion gap to make the world a kinder place? And I've been beavering away mostly in health and social care, and to a degree in elite sports and business and other environments. And I've been very fortunate to travel really around the world around that question. But I started to think about, is there something sociological here that we're missing about proximity, about citizenship, about neighborliness? And why Leeds? Well, that was really driven by Angela Burnett, who is a senior manager in the NHS, who came along to one of the compassion circles that I ran, and just was totally inspiring because she said, well, we need to work with this. This is really important. What can we do? So Angela and I became firm friends. Soon after that, I think you got introduced, Josh. You were down in Devon, but you have a very strong connection to Leeds, your work on the network of wellbeing. And then immediately, I think you and I and Angela began to unpack, and then with David from the Buddhist Center and Mel, we began to unpack what is this relationship actually between compassion, well-being, kindness, and place. So I think that's what was going on.
And I think that question that the group were addressing, I think it was the group that had been involved in one of your compassionate leadership trainings, was what if a neighborhood is a structure for health and well-being, or a structure for ill health and ill-being, how can we make a difference in that? And it was that it seemed was the question at the Buddhist Center that was asked, which resulted in the idea of a festival, as I recall.
And I think yes. And I think what was happening, Josh, and I remember you being very explicit about your experience of this, is that we were using some of the compassionate practices that had evolved in our meetings. We were using the compassion circle work to reflect on these deep questions around how do we want to live and die? What kind of place do we want to live in? If we were to be thinking systemically, then what kind of more favorable conditions could we be creating for human flourishing? And I think that thinking gave rise to, well, there must be a lot to celebrate here. There must be a lot to sit with. So why not have a festival? And I think initially it was a festival of compassion, and then it evolved into a festival of compassion, kindness, and well-being, which gave rise to the Kinder Leeds movement. And as I've continued to sit with these questions, our context since 2017, 2018, when we met, has evolved in a completely extraordinary way, which would have been impossible to predict, with these huge waves, with Brexit, the climate strike, climate change, COVID, structural racism, George Floyd. the context that we now have, I think, creates what Martin Luther King described in his I Have a Dream speech as a fierce urgency of now. So I'm really excited to talk to you about today about, okay, well, if we were to create a conscious shift, how might we measure that shift, or what intentions might we develop, which gives rise to the possibility of a new economy, which could be framed as the kindness economy. And then, so how would we know we were operating in this new economy?
So tell me a little bit how you came up with the concept of the new KPI. What led you to question the old KPI, the key performance indicator model that most businesses and organizations work on?
I had a conversation with a man who sort of self-identifies as a drug addict. He's on methadone script at the moment. He's had a pretty traumatic childhood, very traumatic childhood, and the way he talks about it, if he hadn't have become violent around age of 14, he probably wouldn't still be alive. That's the way he talked about it. He had to resort to violence to survive. He ended up, after pretty hefty professional extended criminality in Dartmoor prison, and then he discovered Buddhism. There was a Buddhist teacher in the prison, and he and 3 of the other inmates never missed a lesson. And this man was, as you'd imagine, an incredible person to speak to about kind of like some of life's deeper lessons. And in one of our long conversations, we take our dogs out for a walk, and we just have these conversations in the park. In one of our long conversations, he was just sharing with me how perverse the system had become in his experience within the prison. And that was because of key performance indicators. So specifically, the story that this man told me was that there's a system within the prison where the lifers, and this man's criminality was serious enough that he was in this cohort, the lifers would, there would be targets set within the prison around parole. This is my understanding. And there are always psychological programs for changing the way prisoners think being run within the prison. Now, because there are key performance indicators about getting serious criminals onto parole and ultimately into probation, the key performance indicator is driving a number which creates a target, which leads to the psychologists, consciously or unconsciously, approaching the most plausible prisoners to go through a psychological program so that they're then most likely to help the prison meet its targets. This is what I've now come to understand as a perverse incentive. So many key performance indicators create perverse incentives and are damaging on deep levels. Now, this is a very concrete example for me, because what it means is the prisoners who may find it the hardest to engage, to make the changes they need to make, to find peace, to find, to get onto a different path, are the least likely to access the psychological programs. And I see this all the time, Josh. I see it in the NHS, I see it in social care, I see it in criminal justice, I see it in the world of business, that unconsciously, and I'm not saying they're bad people in the prison or the psychologists are doing it intentionally, but the system is so stacked against us because the money flows towards the numbers, and the numbers are very often unconsciously, sometimes consciously, let's face it, oppressive. So they're creating harm. They're exacerbating the harm and damage that already exists systemically. So that's when I started to think about the potential oppressive nature of key performance indicators. And then the other sort of side of this is that, as I think I've said already, I've been thinking for a long time about the question, how do we close the compassion gap to make the world a kinder place? And then on one of my walks in nature, I had just had this thought, KPI, key performance indicators, kinder place indicators. So then I started thinking about, well, how would you know you were working in a kinder place? How would you know you were living in a kinder place? How would you know you were being supported in a kinder prison or in a kinder school or in a kinder hospital? So then I was thinking a lot about kinder place indicators. And then I started to play with that idea with senior managers in the NHS and business people. And people were kind of lighting up. It was amazing. Because when I say to people, so, you know, how do you feel about your KPIs, you know, your performance management, you could literally feel the energy drop in the room. People go, oh no, you know, KPIs, performance management, appraisal. It's like a tyranny. It's so consistently oppressive because it's dehumanizing. And then when I say in quite a playful way, there's some good news. There's a new KPI. I call it the kinder place indicator. You call it the kindness performance indicator. So, and then the question that flows from that is, and this is like, if there's one thing I'd like to get across on this call, it's to sit with this question. How would you love the effectiveness of what you do to be measured? That's the instrumental question I've discovered. And when you give a group of people space to think about that, how would you love the effectiveness of what you do to be measured? That could be your effectiveness as a parent. That could be your effectiveness as a neighbor, as a business owner, as a social entrepreneur, as an NHS leader. And then what's flowed from that is all kinds of creativity and wonderful insight into, okay, well, what would a kinder world look, sound, and feel like? How would we know that we were moving towards that world? That's a long answer. I hope that makes sense.
No, that's really helpful, Andy. Thanks ever so much. I think giving a concrete example like that to show how a linear, rational approach, which you would think would make sense, actually ends up being dysfunctional.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things that's part of this uprising of kindness that is across the board, that seems to be coming to the surface with all these challenges that we're facing in terms of COVID and everything else, seems to be to say we've been looking at things in the wrong way. It's not that people are bad people, that people are trying to create a dysfunctional society or dysfunctional results. Quite the opposite. But there's something about the way that we're thinking that hasn't engaged with, if you like, a holistic perspective rather than a focused result. And I just want to go to this idea of what would a kind of business or a kind of economy look like if the new KPIs were about more than just money. I remember Joseph Stiglitz, the famous economist, saying, if we measure the wrong things, we do the wrong things. And in a sense, that's what you're saying too. And I'm just wondering how you would go about, for example, take two examples. One, you do compassionate leadership training, I think, with NHS groups and so on, and also with businesses. And I'm just wondering how you would go about looking at the new KPIs in terms of both kinder places and kindness performance indicators, so that rather than the bottom line being growing money, obviously people have to do that. We're not saying that that profit in itself is a bad thing. It's a question of also what it grows as well. And I wonder how you would go about addressing those questions with people.
Let me see if I can say something about healthcare systems and something about business. So I think one begins by stepping back and really reframing our understanding of what wealth is. Now, I think I learned this from you, Josh, so I'm very grateful for this. I think it was you that taught me that the root of the word wealth is actually wellness and health. Certainly one understanding that one frame that one can. So I think it's as you've been alluding to there in your remarks, this is as deep and as fundamental as the paradigm, what is it that we see as we look out into the world? What is our basic understanding of what we're here for? It really is as deep as that. What is it that matters at a deep level? And this is not woo-woo or spiritual. It's very practical. It's very, very practical. So let me unpack this with a couple of examples. First one from the healthcare space. So real world example, had a day with a group of senior managers in the NHS who were tasked with hugely complex matters around the future, population health, what does provision look, sound and feel like for people in this locality? Extraordinary pressures, you know, one could make an argument that there's been a kind of an ideological pressure on, and, you know, cuts and austerity. So that kind of context, very, very complex and difficult. This is pre-COVID, so this will be about September last year from memory. And we did this work together on this reframe, the shift from key performance to kind of place. And actually what we were playing with was, okay, well, we're not going to in one giant leap go from one to the other. So what would a more integrated worldview look, sound and feel like for you? Because these senior NHS managers were getting a bit twitchy. They're not suddenly going to throw out all of their KPIs, their key performance indicators, overnight, because that's what the system, that's how the money flows, that's how the management is done. But so it's just holding it lightly. How could we begin to reframe? What would it look, sound and feel like? And I just got people into pairs and they were doing some structured listening. And then we said, so if there's one pivotal kind of kindness performance indicator that you could start working with tomorrow, what would that be? And we sort of people threw some ideas around, and we said, so we're having to work at it. So if we were just to settle on one, what would it settle on? And what they settled on, we were all being listened to routinely, was their kindness performance indicator. So well, what do you mean? Well, because we were practicing this, because these are compassion circle practices, listening with the quiet mind. They said we'd be doing what we're doing here. We'd be having space to really be listened to. Well, how often? Weekly. For how long? 30 minutes. Okay, so this is the system. So this group of senior NHS leaders then said, we're going to make a commitment that all the people in our system are listened to routinely for 30 minutes a week. And they said, well, how are you going to measure it? And somebody just started doing this sort of, you know, spreadsheet, but not on a computer, on a piece of paper. And they just drew a column down the left. They put the person's name. They put the weeks along the top. They drew some lines. They said, we're going to tick a box to show that it's happened every week. And so in a kind of world, we're not being oppressed. We're being liberated. And we can only be liberated when we're listened to. Okay, so what are we being listened to about? Well, we share this context. We share the context of complexity, but also creativity and, you know, human potential. So that's an example from healthcare. Is we know we're being listened to.
Could I comment?
Of course, please do.
I think that's a really great example. One of the, if you take two conceptual ways of looking at things, one would be linear rationalism, and the other would be, if you like, whole systems approaches. And what you're saying, and in terms of whole systems, they're now talking about sensing the landscape, sensing what is in the space that we're all involved with. And that kind of sensing through just that idea of listening to everybody allows a different kind of information. Because I think one of the reasons why that dysfunction that you've described before happens, again, it's not because people want to undermine the results, quite the opposite. It's being able to access all the different kinds of information, and that is what happens when people are really in relationship, when people are listening to each other, when people are respectful of each other. And I think the phrase that you came up was putting the careability into the capability. And so I think that's a really good example of how that could happen. I'd like to ask you now if you could also, is that possible in a framework of business where business obviously has to have a bottom line, and can business create a frame, as you did with the NHS managers, which is holding lightly, what else,
Mhm.
what kind of social value, what kind of creativity could we, and wisdom could we harvest from all of the people involved in this space that we're all working together in?
Yeah. Well, the answer, okay. So there's so much being sparked here. I'm really enjoying the conversation. I'm really appreciating the space, Josh. It's great. So what business am I in? What business are we in? What do we mean when we use the term the bottom line? So I've been in business for 20 years, and my bottom line is I want my business to be a force for good. I want my business to create 5 wins. So this is one of the things that's come through more recently in terms of thinking about the kindness economy. So the kindness economy can be thought of as foundational. So the kindness economy is oriented to people, to much more to what people need rather than what people want. So it's much more sustainable. And there are multiple businesses that are consciously operating in that space. And there are many, many businesses that are now being challenged to evolve more quickly so that they operate in that foundational space. Because let's face it, Greta Thunberg and her mates are not going to buy from businesses that are unconscious. It's just not going to happen. So where I've got to with this, and I'll unpack this with a couple of specific examples in a moment or two, but where I've got to in this is that the conscious businesses that are operating within the kindness economy, the foundational economy, are creating 5 wins. So a way to think about this. So the first win is that the way they operate is good for business. Because if it's not good for business, it's not going to sustain. You touched on profit, and we could perhaps in a future conversation talk much more about what we mean by profit, because that in itself is kind of philosophical and complex, and shareholder value, and you can get deeply into that in terms of business paradigms. That's probably for the next conversation. But it's got to be good for business. It's got to create a flow of positive energy, and one form of positive energy is money, because people need to get paid. That's the currency, right? That's how we operate. People need to put bread on the table. They need to heat their homes. They may or may not need to go on a foreign holiday and have a car on the drive. That's, again, something we could talk more about, is what people really need. But a lot of people aspire to those things. It's part of our culture. So it's got to be good for business. That's the first win. So you've got to figure out what your formula is. You've got to have something to sell that people want and need. Otherwise, you're doomed. So that's practical. So we've got that one out of the way. The next win is it's got to be good for the... Oh, bear with me a second, Josh. Sorry, I just had a call coming in there from a colleague, so forgive me. So the first win is it's good for business. The second win is it's got to be good for the individual. Because if individuals are flourishing, they're more productive. And I remember you and I had a really exciting conversation about the difference between unhealthy productivity and healthy productivity. So if the way that we're doing business is injurious on the level of the individual, it's not sustainable. It's not good. I am going to give an example of a name, because I think there's enough evidence that some of the systemic conditions have been toxic for people working at Sports Direct. It's not good to have rapid turnover or to rely on people being paid 0 hours contract. It's not good it's not good on the level of the individual. Conversely, if you really tune into the needs of individuals and you create a workplace which is integrated with those needs, you can say, yeah, look people in the eye and say, is working for my business good for you? If that person can't say yes, then you haven't got that second win, which brings me to the third win, which is good for families. So is the way we're working good for your families? Can we say to our partners, our husbands, our wives, our loved ones, Dad works in this place, is that good for him or not? Because if it's not good for him, it's not good for you. Because if he's shattered when he comes in from work and he's not there to cook, to read the story to the child before they go to bed, that's not good either. So there's the level of family well-being. Is it good for families? That's a third win. Which, by extension, then the fourth win is it good for communities? So if it's good for business, good for individuals, good for families, it's pretty likely to be good for communities. But that's another intention that a business can develop. force for good? How are we contributing to the life of community? What does that look like? What is our purpose? Yeah, we've got some things to sell, as I've said already, but what are our values? What are we here for? Why do we exist? And now I'm going to refer back to Greta Thunberg. Fifth win, is it good for the planet? Is the way that we're operating good for the planet? So business, self, family, communities, planet. And it's a wonderful kind of framework to walk around with, because I'm literally finding individuals and businesses that consciously or unconsciously have understood that. I'm thinking about Peddy Cargo in Hereford, which is one of the fastest growing businesses, where they're using bikes to move important things around the city like blood and like recycled cardboard. And they can't get enough cyclists because, of course, things are changing so quickly. So I'm thinking about Timpsons, with, you know, the key cutters. Incredibly integrated paradigm of what they call upside down management. So the people that run the Timpsons shops have a very high level of ownership. Many of them have come out of the criminal justice system. Extraordinary. The leaders of that business have a very, very deep awareness of kindness and of diversity and of inclusion and of equality. And they recognize that when the favorable conditions are created, then quite naturally people love to come into work. And it's not even necessarily about the nuts and bolts of what they do at work. It's about being part of something that's culturally proactive and sociologically favorable to the people who are part of it. And there's all sorts of ways that people can co-create new realities in the workplace that are more favorable for us on those 5 levels.
So what you're saying in a way is that it is totally possible to have a compassionate city and a strong economy, which is the strapline of Leeds City Council. But what that requires is a reframing that enables social value, an environmental value, and real productivity, healthy productivity to be supported. You could say those 5 measures that you're talking about relate to the 5 ways to well-being, you know, which are connect, get active, take notice, keep learning, and give. And I'm always fascinated by the overlapping perspectives of health and economy. I don't know if you're familiar with the term salutogenesis, which is, if you like, a strength-based approach to health, rather than a pathogenic approach to health. And you could say that we need to move our unconscious pathogenic approach to business and organization to a strengths-based approach around our shared purpose. And I think what you have named, because I think naming is an important element in framing and in measurement, of course, is a really important step towards the building back better that so many people want today. I don't know whether you have any other thoughts about the new KPI and what it might contribute, and to share with us before we finish.
A couple of thoughts are sparked. Yes to integrating these perspectives on dis-ease and unconsciousness with this more evolved perspective on, if we're to meet, you know, back to my point really about being a force for good. You know, what kind of force are we as a business? What kind of downstream effects are we creating for our people and the world around us? The way we relate to our suppliers, the way we think about the way we're sourcing our products, the way our products are being moved around the world, the stories we tell about who we are. There are so many opportunities. So a couple of examples have been sparked, quite practical. One's about a recent experience with mum and dad, who were a part of the Motability scheme. So we were, their Motability, which is where you folks with limited mobility are able to access a car, and you kind of have quite an open space to think about what that car might be. So Mum and Dad are very conscious about the planet, so thinking about a hybrid, that would be a first. The last car, they were advised to get a diesel. So we're shopping around in car showrooms, and because of some of Mum and Dad's challenges, I sort of was proactive and went ahead and did that shopping around. And yeah, it was a fascinating experience really around where each of those manufacturers were in relation to both the issues around Motability and how embodied they were in that space, how seriously they took the accessibility needs of their customers, and how evolved they were around using cars to move around, using electric, using hydrogen, using hybrids, using combustion engines. And I was amazed at the difference in both of those spaces. They ended up with a Toyota hybrid, a Toyota Yaris hybrid. And I was very struck by this. The frame that Toyota is using is togetherness. So that was really interesting. So they've thought very deeply about Motability, about sustainability, about, maybe, I don't know whether they've sat and thought directly about kindness, but there's a word in Japanese that I can't remember that means togetherness. Mum and Dad were actually given this little figure that denotes this togetherness that sits in the back of the car. So that was an interesting example. And then one of the other manufacturers had barely got going on either listening deeply about the Motability issues or evolving the new cars that we need to make our planet sustainable. The other example is in a way more prosaic, which is the boiler man. And I'm aware that I've shared this story with you before, Josh, but I think it bears retelling. So boiler breaks down in our family home. We make a call. The person on the other end of the phone says, "Oh, I'm really sorry, your boiler's broken down. It's going to cost you about £3,000 to replace it." Oh no, second opinion. The boiler man on the end of the phone says, "Can you tell me the model, the make?" "Oh, I think you'll find that's this part. It's going to cost you 70 quid. I'll come out in the next couple of days." Okay, well, there's a big difference there in terms of profiteering, etc. Anyway, so this man comes out. I'm meeting him for the first time. As he's fixed the boiler, as you do, I've offered him a cup of tea. We're having a chat. He seems pretty tired and, he's obviously working really hard. I tell him how grateful I am for his service because he saved me nearly £3,000. And he's there in the evening. He's had a really busy day. So we just get talking like you do. I find out that his wife is a nurse and that he's got a 17-year-old and I think a 6-year-old from memory. And then he says, he literally said, "I lie to my wife every day." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, every day she asks me what time I'm going to be home from work. And every day, I don't mean to, I'm not doing it deliberately, but every day I give her a time that she wants to hear. And I'm never home on time because I'm working so hard." Then they started talking about this regret where he just wasn't really there in the life of the 17-year-old because he was always at work. And so his wife's a nurse, she's working full time, she's holding things in the house and they're rowing, they're falling out. So it felt to me like this man's life was very out of balance. And I said, and he was asking me about my work and I was talking about some of these things and talking about healthy. I just remember mentioning healthy productivity. I wasn't really talking about kindness. Healthy productivity. He said, "What do you mean healthy productivity?" I said, "Well, it's the kind of productivity where your life is more in balance." So I've just got all these jobs. I've got to, it takes me hours to, get my invoices out. I've got to pack up my tools at the end of the day. I get in late, I said, "Well, how would it be to think just for a moment about doing something very differently with your 6-year-old than you did with your 17-year-old so that you don't look back on your 6-year-old life with this feeling of regret that you've shared with me?" Anyway, we talked about it. And where he got to was, "I'm going to finish work at 3:00 on a Wednesday every week." And I've got goosebumps telling you this story. I'm going to pick up my child from school. We're going to go to the park. Then we're going to cook the tea. And if you just imagine the shift in that family system that creates, that child knows that dad is coming, and he's a lovely bloke, that dad is coming every Wednesday, that they're going to the park, and then that they're cooking tea. And the feeling of the balance that brings in and the release that creates for the whole family So that's a story about the new kindness. A kindness performance indicator is about balance. So how do we balance the needs of the business, the individual, the family, the community, and the planet in that case? And actually, I haven't caught up with this person, but my assumption would be that he'll be more productive, not less. He won't lose any money because he'll be happier in his skin. There'll be less arguments. They'll be making different choices. So, yeah, I mean, I've been beavering away on compassion and kindness for many years, and I've been attacked for that, and it's been complex to think about compassion and kindness in healthcare, never mind business. But actually, I'm so grateful for this conversation, Josh, because if anything, it's re-energized me to actually say, this is not pink and fluffy. This is not incidental. This is pragmatic. If you want to talk about being hard-nosed, we've got to find a way to sustain our business. We've got to find a way to sustain our lives. We've got to find a way to sustain our planet. So we've got to think differently about the way we take up space, about the way we work, about the way we parent, about the way we care for ourselves, each other, and the world around us.
That's really great, Andy. Thanks ever so much. And I'm sure that people will be following the progress of the kindness performance indicators and the kinder places indicators as we go forward. We'll certainly try and promote more events around these issues, because the festival is intending to go on for the next 5 years. So thanks again. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for your practicality and your down-to-earth insights.